Egyptian kings wrote it. Assyrian kings wrote it. Hittite kings wrote it. We left no survivors. The exact same 4 words Israel's scribes wrote about Canaan. And historians can prove, from those very same inscriptions, that the enemies those kings claimed to erase kept on living for centuries afterward. So what happens when Israel writes the identical sentence? Most people never ask that question, because most people never get past the first reaction. God told a nation to kill children. Full stop. And whatever comes after that sentence usually sounds like a dodge. They were evil. They deserved it. God's ways are higher than ours. Those answers are not wrong because they are religious. They are wrong because they are cheap. They let you stop thinking exactly where the thinking needs to start. So we are not going to do that here. We are going to look at the actual words, the actual scholarship, and the actual place where every honest answer runs out. And we are going to be honest about what is left standing at the end. Here is the sentence that will not let you look away. 1 Samuel 15:3. Kill both man and woman, child and infant. Not a battlefield report written after the fact. A command, handed to Saul before a single sword was drawn, naming a nursing infant as a target. If you read only that verse, the case against the God who gave it looks closed. And the people who take that verse most seriously are not the skeptics who want an excuse to dismiss Scripture. They are the scholars who have spent careers defending it, and who admit, out loud, in print, that this specific line does not resolve as easily as the rest of the conquest narrative does. That admission is where this conversation actually has to begin, not where it ends. Because most of the conquest language surrounding that verse was never meant to be counted like a body count. Utterly destroy. All the land. Left no survivor. Those are not unique to Israel's scribes. Historians who compared Israel's war reports side by side with Egyptian, Hittite, and Assyrian royal inscriptions found the identical phrases, word for word, describing the identical kind of victory. And in more than one of those foreign inscriptions, we can check the history against the boast. The enemy that a king claimed to erase from the earth shows up again generations later, alive, taxed, governed, very much not erased. Ancient war reports were not written for accuracy. They were written the way a campaign speech is written. Total victory. No exceptions. Every syllable designed to make the king sound absolute, not to hand a future reader a literal casualty count. Read Joshua's all the land and no survivor against that background, and the horror does not disappear. But it stops being a spreadsheet and starts being a genre you have to learn to read before you can judge it fairly. There is a second layer underneath the word itself, and it is stranger than hyperbole. The Hebrew word behind utterly destroy is cherem. And cherem was never primarily a word about killing efficiently. It meant something devoted, handed over, given completely to God, and taken permanently out of human use. The plunder under cherem could not be kept, could not be sold, could not be touched. It belonged to Yahweh alone, which means the ancient reader was not hearing a war strategy. They were hearing a liturgy, a ritual act of consecration wearing the language of a battle report. That does not make it comfortable. If anything, it is more unsettling, not less, because it means this was never described as rage. It was described as worship. And a God who receives that kind of offering is a harder question than a God who simply loses his temper. We need to slow down here, because it would be easy to let genre and ritual language quietly erase the discomfort, and that is not honest either. Hyperbole explains all the land and no survivor. It does not fully explain a specific list, naming a nursing infant by category, aimed at a specific living people at a specific moment, centuries after the original conquest formulas were written. Even the scholars who built the strongest case for reading these texts as ancient rhetoric concede that 1 Samuel 15:3 sits outside the clean pattern. That is not a crack in their argument you are supposed to ignore. That is the one place the argument itself tells you to stop and look harder. There is another explanation worth sitting with before we get to where this actually lands. And it comes from inside the text itself, centuries before Joshua ever crosses the Jordan. In Genesis 15, God tells Abraham his descendants will not possess the land for 400 years, and gives a reason that sounds almost bureaucratic next to everything else in that chapter. The sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure, not a punishment handed out on a whim. A judgment held back, deliberately, for 4 centuries, waiting for a moral debt to finish accumulating before it is called in. Read that way, the conquest is not a land grab dressed up as religion. It is closer to the flood, or to Sodom, judgment on entrenched, generational wrongdoing rather than a verdict on someone's ethnicity. That framing removes one problem. It does not remove all of them. Because, whatever the moral logic behind judging a nation, the text still narrates children inside that judgment, and a 400-year waiting period does not by itself answer why the sentence, when it finally arrives, reads the way it reads in Saul's specific war against the Amalekites generations later. So look harder at the ground itself, because there is a question underneath the text that almost nobody asks on either side of this argument. Did the conquest happen exactly the way it reads? Archaeologists who have spent decades digging at Jericho have found no destroyed city wall from the period the conquest narrative describes. No burn layer at the right depth. No fortified settlement large enough to match the story at all. That does not erase every hard word in the text. But it does mean that some of the horror people feel rests on an assumption the ground itself does not support, that this happened in real time, at a real address, exactly as narrated. Some of Israel's war memory reads less like a battlefield transcript, and more like a nation writing its own founding story generations later, the way every ancient people did. None of that removes 1 Samuel 15:3 from the table. It just means we are not only wrestling with what God did, we are wrestling with what a text says God did, written by people, for reasons, at a distance from the events themselves. This is the part where most channels either speed past the discomfort or manufacture false comfort to cover it. We are not going to do either. Quick word before we continue. If this kind of honest, source-checked study is something you want more of, consider becoming a channel member. That support is the reason we can keep doing the slow work instead of the easy version. And to those of you who already support this channel, thank you. You are part of every script we produce. Here is where the honest residue sits, plainly, without a bow tied around it. Genre explains the formulas. Ritual language explains the frame. Judgment explains the timing. Distance from the event reopens the historical question. But none of that fully dissolves a command that names an infant. The strongest defenders of Scripture do not claim it does. And that is not a failure of faith. Refusing to pretend a hard verse is easy is what faith looks like when it is being honest. But an unresolved verse is not the same as an unresolved trajectory, and Scripture does not freeze here. Centuries later, in Ezekiel 18, the same God who is accused of collective judgment declares that the child will not bear the guilt of the parent, that each person will answer only for their own sin. That is not a contradiction quietly slipped into the canon. It is Scripture correcting its own earlier moral categories from the inside, moving towards something clearer than where it started. John Calvin, reading these ancient conquest texts centuries before modern archaeology existed, described God as speaking to Israel the way a nurse speaks to an infant, not because the infant's understanding was the finish line, but because you cannot teach calculus to a child who has not learned to count. Meeting a limited people where they stood was never the same as freezing them there forever. One more position deserves its own moment, because it takes the discomfort more seriously than almost any other reading available. The theologian Gregory Boyd argues that the violent portrait sitting inside these conquest texts is not God's own self-revelation at all. It is the ancient author's fallen, war-shaped imagination pressed onto the page, and later corrected by the one place Scripture shows us God's actual character without distortion, the cross. On this reading, 1 Samuel 15 is less a window into who God is and more a mirror of who the people writing about him still were. It is a serious answer, and it takes the infant in that verse more seriously than a purely rhetorical reading does, but it comes with its own cost. Critics inside the same evangelical tradition Boyd writes from have pushed back hard, arguing that if entire sections of the Old Testament can be read as the author's projection rather than revelation, you are no longer interpreting a hard text, you are quietly setting parts of your own Bible aside. That tension does not resolve cleanly either. It just relocates the residue instead of removing it. And that trajectory, whichever position carries you through it, runs all the way to a garden, centuries later, where a sword is drawn one final time in Scripture's story, and Jesus tells the man holding it to put it away. Not soften it. Not qualify it. Put your sword back. The same God who is present in the hardest pages of Joshua and 1 Samuel is the God who eventually stands in front of violence in human form and refuses it completely, absorbing the cost himself instead of ordering someone else to pay it. If you want to know what God's character actually weighs when every accommodation, every ritual frame, every ancient genre convention is stripped away, that is where you have to stand and look. Not at Jericho. At the cross. That does not erase 1 Samuel 15:3. It reframes what kind of question it actually is. Not is God secretly a monster, but why does a God who ends at the cross begin somewhere this hard? And what does it cost him to walk his own people out of it slowly instead of all at once? That is a harder question than the internet's dodge, and it is a more honest one than the internet's outrage. So here is where we land. Without pretending the ground is smoother than it is. The plain reading is not the dodge, and the dodge is not the plain reading either. Genre is not an excuse, and outrage is not the whole picture. Ritual language does not make the discomfort disappear, and neither does an archaeologist's shovel, and neither does a 400-year waiting period. What remains is a text with a real, unresolved weight sitting inside it, carried by a God whose story does not end where Joshua ends, and does not end where Samuel ends either. It ends at a cross, with a sword put back in its sheath, and a command that finally, permanently, changes. If this kind of study, the kind that refuses both the easy defense and the easy attack, is worth more of your time, subscribe. Leave a comment. Even one word helps this reach someone still stuck on the verse that started this video. Share it with someone who's been told to just have faith about this and never actually got an honest answer. And may the God who walked his own people out of their hardest chapters slowly, patiently, all the way to a cross, meet you in whatever hard chapter you are standing in right now. God bless you.